All right, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to another Toolbox webinar from the Northeastern ITM Center. There are 80 people so far on the call, and we actually have a lot of people registered. So this is a topic that a lot of people are interested in. I'm Jana Hipster. I work for the Northeastern ITM Center, and this webinar is going to be on what you need to know about the spotted lanternfly, a new invasive insect that's currently in Pennsylvania. And we are extremely fortunate to have Julie Urban, Heather Leach, and Dave Jackson here with us, who are experts in spotted lanternfly, and they're going to share with you what they know, what's developing, and give you a heads up. And before we begin, there is a couple of housekeeping things that I want to share with you. One is you don't need to take furious notes because there's going to be a recording of this webinar. It'll be posted sometime in the next week. And also the slides will be available. So if there is a link on the slide that you want to go back to, you can just go and look at the slides. And we'll provide a link to where the recording will be at the end as well. And we'll also email people who've been registered for this. We have 5 slots of time available for questions and answers. We've got like 20 minutes set aside for that. And what I suggest you do is use the Q&A feature. So if you scroll your mouse over your screen, you'll see that there's a little box that shows up either at the top or the bottom, and it says Q&A on it somewhere in the middle of that black box. It says Q&A. If you click on there, you can type your questions, and you can do it with your name or you can do it anonymously. Either one is fine. And we have Nancy Cusimano here, who's going to be monitoring the questions. And when we take a Q&A break, she'll ask some of the questions that come up. There you go, there's Nancy. And so please try not to use the chat feature. It's hard for us to keep noticing 2 places. So just use the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. And then the other thing that I want to do is introduce you to our panelists. So we have Julie Urban. She is a Senior Research Associate in the Department of Entomology at Penn State. And she uses molecular tools such as gene barcoding to study microbes important to the spotted lanternfly and other plant hoppers. So welcome, Julie.
Hi, good morning.
And we have Heather Leach. She's the Spotted Lanternfly Extension Associate in the Department of Entomology at Penn State. And Heather is responsible for coordinating the extension efforts related to education, research, and regulatory activities on spotted lanternfly. So, hi, Heather. Great. And we also have Dave Jackson. He's an extension educator in forest resources with Penn State. And Dave has expertise on forest health, timber production, and invasive species, including tree of heaven. Great, welcome. So before we get going, I am going to ask a couple of questions just so we know who you are and what you might be interested in based on who you are. So what you should see is a poll that has just showed up, and we're asking 2 simple questions. So one, what is your background? Are you a homeowner, home gardener, pest control company, green industry, researcher, extension personnel, farmer, or other? And which region are you located in? And we're interested if you're in Pennsylvania or in the Northeast, but outside of Pennsylvania, in the Midwest, the South or the West. I don't expect any people from the West since it's really early there, but March, it's not too early. So I'm just going to give us a minute for people to answer these questions, and then I'll share the responses so that you can see them all. Okay, we still have a couple more people voting, so I'll just give you 5 more seconds. If anyone else wants to vote, now's your chance. All right. Okay. And we actually have quite a few people from the South. Interesting. So I'm going to end the poll and I can share the results with you. So you can see that we've got, most people are homeowners and home gardeners, 48%, followed by extension personnel, and then other, which is interesting. I'd like to know what the other category is. And then 43% of people are in Pennsylvania. And the next highest proportion actually is in the south rather than the northeast outside. So that's telling me they've got issues with spotted lanternfly in the south. So great. So given that, we'll now move on. And here we go. And so we're going to start with Heather, and she's going to tell us what is a spotted lanternfly and where does it come from?
Yeah, so good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining on the webinar, and thanks, Jana, for that introduction. If you might notice, we are in the kids section of a Barnes & Noble, so hopefully there's not too much background noise here, but we're also in the midst of doing an insecticide trial on spotted lanternflies, so things are a little hectic on our end, but we're really excited to give you an update on spotted lanternfly and what we've got going on with it. The other cool thing about this webinar is we really want it to be interactive and get your questions. So as Jana said, as you're coming up with questions, definitely type those in the Q&A for us. And so next slide.
All right. Yep.
So spotted lanternfly is an invasive plant hopper. It's a kind of insect that was found in southeastern Pennsylvania in 2014. Its original native range is in Asia. So next slide. So here is a map of southeastern Pennsylvania. You can kind of see the inset of where we're located there. So in the yellow is where it was first found in 2014, and then it was spread in 2015 to the orange, 2016 to the blue, and 2017 to the green. And as of today, we're still in those that green area. So that's 13 counties that have spotted lanternfly detections, and those are also currently under quarantine in the state of Pennsylvania. So I can talk a little bit about what that means as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. And if we look a little bit more broadly, not just at Pennsylvania, but of course at all the other states that might be affected by this, we see just recently that New Jersey had found some populations and quickly put 3 counties under quarantine for spotted lanternfly. There's also one satellite population in Virginia near Winchester that we know spotted lanternfly exists. And there's also been other detections. So if Jana, you want to move to the next slide. Spotted lanternfly was also discovered in Delaware in 2017. Now this is not a confirmed population, but it's just a single sighting of an adult. And in the next slide, you'll see in New York that was found as well. That was found in 2017. And if you forward one, Jana. As of a couple of days ago, it was found in 2018 in the Finger Lakes region and also near Albany, New York. So clearly, again, these are just single adults that are being found, so no population of them is established, but this is really telling us that this insect has a huge capacity to spread. It's a really good hitchhiker, and so we want to make sure that people are aware of this pest and the threat it causes and presents. So that's kind of what I'll be talking out the rest of this. Just quickly, I'll go over the life cycle of spotted lanternfly. So they lay their eggs starting right about now, so in late September and all the way through December. Now those eggs are the stage that overwinters. The adults die in the winter as the first couple freezes hit, but the eggs overwinter and then they hatch out as nymphs in the spring. So the first 3 nymphs look fairly similar. They're black with these bright white spots, and then the last instar the 4th instar is bright red, and then they shift into adults in about July. Now we do see in the Virginia population that they're a little bit ahead of us by about 1 to 2 weeks. So we're expecting that their population is going to lay eggs a little bit before us just because it's a little warmer there. So as this moves into other states, we also might see different trends here, but this is what we're seeing in Pennsylvania. So just to give you some photos of what these look like, the eggs are indicated in A. So you can see eggs are laid on the tree, and then there's sort of like a splash of mud. That is their egg mass, and it's coated in some sort of putty-like covering that looks like mud. The nymphs, again, so there's those black nymphs, which look fairly similar from 1st to 3rd instar, and then the 4th star that turns red. And then finally, we're left with those adults, which you might be familiar with seeing if you haven't seen them before. These are often what people put in newspapers and social media posts and things like that, especially with their wings out, and you can see those bright red patches on their hind wings. More often than not, we actually see the adults with their wings closed over their bodies, as in the image on the left. But when they're startled or when they're poisoned with insecticide, things like that, they will start to open their wings, and you can see that coloration. So I want to back up and make sure that everybody knows how spotted lanternfly feeds and how it's doing its damage. So spotted lanternfly is a hemipteran insect, which means it's a piercing, sucking insect. So it's closely related to things like cicadas, brown marmorated stink bugs, which you might be familiar with, aphids, and other leafhoppers. What that means is it's got a long beak that it uses to suck out plant fluid. So if you go to the next slide and then click one forward, thank you. You'll see that white box is highlighting the stylet, or the mouth part, which it uses to tap into plants and suck out that plant sap. So you're looking at the underside of a spotted lanternfly, and again, you can see that long beak that it uses to draw out plant sap. So that's how they're doing their damage. They're kind of what we call an indirect pest. So they're not directly damaging fruits. So they're not going to feed directly on an apple or a grape, but they're going to feed on the vine and on the trunk of an apple. Again, if you click one forward, you can see this spotted lanternfly has its mouth parts tapped into that plant, so you can kind of see what that looks like. It might look a little bit like a leg, but if you watch, you can actually see it probing, and then it will stick its mouth part in the plant and start to draw out that plant sap. So it has a very large host range when we talk about what plants it's actually attacking. It does have what we call a preferred hosts. Those are tree of heaven, which Dave Jackson will talk all about later. It's also feeds heavily on black walnut, grape, and hops. And if you click one forward, Yana, we can see that it feeds on over 70 different host plants. So things like apple, maple, birch, sycamore, a lot of different hosts that it's feeding on. And so that means that really anything out in the landscape is kind of fair game for spotted lanternfly, except for conifers. So we haven't really seen them feed on conifers, but nearly everything else we will observe them feeding on.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I see that there's a question come through. So Nancy, would you like to ask the question?
Sure, I have one question and one comment, actually 2 questions. So I'll read the comment first. Chiming in from Virginia, I just heard from our extension entomologist that the Virginia population are laying eggs now. So you guys are right on with your schedule that it's a little earlier. The first question I have is, does Dove dish soap kill or minimize lanternflies? Dove dish soap.
Yeah, so this is has been a really common thing where I'll talk a little bit later about what damage we're actually seeing on the plant and how it's really inundated homeowners, and they're kind of looking for anything they can to kill spotted lanternfly, which means that they're turning to household supplies, things like bleach and gasoline and dish soap. In reality, these products, household products, are really unsafe to use on your plants and spotted lanternfly. In the case of dish soap, there's a couple of issues with that. So what it does when you spray it on spotted lanternfly, it's a contact, and so when it contacts the spotted lanternfly, it covers the spiracles and basically suffocates them. However, it also can cause damage to the plant, so it kind of acts like a magnifying glass on the plant, and will intensify the sun and then will cause leaf burn. The other issue associated with that is that there's no label for use. It's not a registered insecticide by the EPA, and this means that people can use it very incorrectly, and it can actually cause damage again to your plants and some other things around your home. So we really want to encourage people to use labeled insecticide products, and some of these can be, environmentally friendly products, and I'm happy to talk more about those options as well. But just making sure that we're using products that are labeled and registered with the EPA.
Second question, is there a particular species of grape that this prefers?
It doesn't seem like it. So it'll feed on both wild and cultivated grape, both Concord and so Niagara grapes, so more native cultivars, and also wine cultivars. So we're not seeing any differences right now with what type of grape.
And I just got in one more. Are the 70+ host plants for both adults and nymphs? What's the host range for adults only?
That's a really good question, and a lot of this we're still trying to figure out. What we're finding is, yes, it's a host range for both adults and nymphs. However, we do see that nymphs are particularly polyphagous, which means they're really going to go after anything. They'll feed on anything. So that goes from, you know, the basil or cucumbers in your backyard to you know, tree of heaven and black walnut, all sorts of things. The adults, especially at a certain point in their life cycle, seem to hone in a little bit more on tree of heaven. And so for the adult stage, tree of heaven might be a little bit more important than it is for the nymph stage.
And if I could add to that, also to make this conversational too, is that oftentimes, you know, while we see that the adults, especially later in the season, tend to prefer tree of heaven, they'll take a meal where they can get it. And so we saw them passing through on apple, taking a meal. When we were collecting insects this morning, I collected them off quite a number of different species of ornamentals at a ski resort in the area. So they, while they favor some things, they still have a broad host range as well.
Do we have time for one more? I just got one more.
Yep, sure.
Is the host range in the US the same as its native range?
I don't think we know that. And part of what Julie will talk about a little bit in her section is the fact that in its native range, it hasn't really been studied. And so because it's not a pest there, right? So it's kept in check with a lot of natural enemies and predators that are already there. So it just hasn't been an insect that has been studied very heavily. Here, however, it's, you know, it's a very different situation where we have explosive populations and no natural enemies that are really keeping it in check. So there's been very limited research done on that, and I don't know if you want to add.
And spotted lanternfly was an invasive that appeared in South Korea in 2004, and so there was research conducted there. And if we look at the host range, or at the host that the Korean literature assembled, we see a very similar pattern here. We're certainly adding different things, but generally, you know, the same genera of plants were fed upon there as here.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll move on to talking about what kind of damage they cause, and Heather's going to lead us through that discussion.
Yeah, so I briefly wanted to show you some photos of what we've seen in infestation areas. You can see, again, this is a good example of how they're not feeding on the apple, but they're feeding on the trunk of the apple. However, there's hundreds of spotted lanternfly feeding there. So really it's a good example of how high the populations can get, and even if spotted lanternfly are feeding for a short time on this apple, they are capable of causing some damage. And so trying to measure what that damage is and understand the plant response has been a big thing that we're trying to work on. The next slide will also show you a second example, and if Yana, you're able to play that video, hopefully that works.
No, I guess not.
You maybe hover your mouse.
There we go. Okay, there we go.
So I wanted to show you this. This is, again, spotted lanternfly feeding on grapevines. As they're feeding on that plant sap, you'll notice these lanternflies every once in a while come down of what look like water. So they're excreting honeydew because they're feeding on that plant sap. So as they feed, they want the nutrients from the plant and not necessarily that sugar water. So you can see them excrete that sugar water over time. And what that does, if you look at some of the lower leaves in that video, you'll see this buildup of this honeydew, this sugar water. And this creates a lot of issues for pretty much everything it's feeding on when you go from either talking about vineyard production, when you talk about even your backyard. So again, if you go to the next slide, you'll see an image of sooty mold that's grown on grape. So when that honeydew sits on those grape leaves or wherever they're feeding and that honeydew is sitting, you'll start to see this colonization of sooty mold, which is kind of this mix of fungi that's growing on that. And so there's a lot of issues, again, associated with this. Sooty mold acts as a sunblock. So when there's so much sooty mold on the leaf, it can no longer photosynthesize. So you're taking harvest quality away from those grapes. And you're also, when you talk about a forest ecosystem, we're seeing so much sooty mold on the understory of where they're feeding on the trees that we're actually seeing die off of those young saplings in the understory. In other situations, if you go to the next slide, oh, this is the damage slide, I apologize. So I just wanted to talk briefly about some of the damage that we're seeing directly from the pest in terms of plant response. So in some cases, it depends on the plant and on the tree. So for some trees, we'll see oozing. We'll also see leaf curl and dieback, things like flagging of trees. We'll see wilting. That's especially for the nymphs will really cause that on garden plants and things like that. And in some cases, we have seen death of trees, and this includes large trees, especially when there's a heavy population for multiple years. We start to see some trees die. So these are scattered instances and is mostly contained to Tree of Heaven. We also see yield losses in both apple and grape. We're still working on getting estimates there and really understanding how severe this is, but particularly in grape, we're seeing some very significant yield losses for the growers that are have had heavy populations of this pest. To date, we are not aware of any pathogens that are transmitted by spotted lanternfly. They certainly have the capacity to transmit pathogens with their piercing, sucking mouth part. They could be dragging diseases around and feeding and spreading diseases that way, but again, we haven't noticed anything like that yet. And then again, there's that sooty mold, which leads to decreased photosynthesis, which has implications for crop production, but again, forest health and regeneration. And then I also wanted to talk about sooty mold in a broader sense. So a lot of you indicated that you were home gardeners and homeowners. There's many instances where I've seen sooty molds on people's decks. So here is a woman who, she power washed her lower step of her deck, but the upper two steps and where that green arrow is indicating was just a buildup of honeydew and sooty mold. So her steps were sticky and covered in mold. And I believe there should be one more slide after this. That shows, again, heavy populations. So on the left, you can see heavy populations of adults on a tree right next to a toy car. And on the right, you can see sooty molds, a little bit of sooty mold beginning, and then that kind of sheen of the leaves is that honeydew that's growing over this woman's understory plants that she's got. So it's certainly a nuisance problem for homeowners, and we're working really hard to try to control this. And we can talk again a little bit about this more, but what we're finding is a really big issue is that there's no way to prevent spotted lanternfly from coming onto your property, onto your vineyard, or in a forest. There's only basically action that you can take to kill the spotted lanternfly that are there, but then again, more will infest. And so that's something that we've really been struggling with across all of these industries and stakeholders that are affected by this.
Thank you. And Nancy, do we have any questions that came in? I think we did.
We do. These are kind of related. Is any predation from birds or other sources been observed? And is there evidence of toxicity to animals consuming them, such as farm animals eating hay or anything like that?
Yeah, those are both very good questions. So for the first one, talking about predators, we do see that generalist predators are attacking spotted lanternfly. So those include things like spiders, praying mantises, wheelbugs. So that's really exciting to see. Unfortunately, they're generalist predators. So that means that they're attacking spotted lanternfly, but also a lot of other things. So they're not focused on the population of spotted lanternfly. So while they might help on a local scale, so if you have a ton of spiders and praying mantises in your backyard, that might help you, but it's not going to overall help the population of spotted lanternfly. There are a couple of parasitoids that also are found to be attacking spotted lanternfly eggs, but again, in very low numbers. So more research is going into that and how we can potentially boost those numbers here in the future. Birds, generally speaking, avoid spotted lanternfly. They do, again, have that flashy red color. So what we're seeing is that they're deterred by spotted lanternfly. Now, there have been a few reports of, in South Korea, of birds eating spotted lanternfly and vomiting after consuming spotted lanternfly, and also some reports here in the US of dogs that ate a lot of spotted lanternfly and then were vomiting after consuming consuming those. We're still working on exactly what's causing that. We have searched for the compound cantharidin. So several labs have looked for that. That's a compound that's a fairly common toxic compound found in other insects. We can't find that one, and so we're thinking it's something else. But again, we're still really working on what's causing that.
Second question. And you may get to actually both of these, I would assume. You may get to this, but are you working with city foresters as well as landowners? Has an ailanthus been used for decades as a street tree? And are they likely to lay eggs on boats and such, or do they primarily lay on trees?
That's a really good question. Working with city landscapers, there's definitely a lot of cities and regulatory people, townships, municipalities that we're working with to try to get control out there, and in some cases chemical control, and in other cases banding, which I'm certainly happy to answer more questions about. So that's great, and I agree. Tree of Heaven is often used as a landscape plant. That's how it was first brought here, is that it was kind of marketed as this tree that grows really fast, and again, Dave can talk about this more, but now it's really become a nuisance. It's found in many places in disturbed areas along roadsides and things like that. And so it's become very difficult to control. The last question I think was about the egg cases. We see that spotted lanternfly will lay egg cases on just about anything, particularly hard surfaces. So boats, certainly, picnic tables, outdoor furniture, stone, fencing, trees, you name it. Cars, yep.
Thank you. Well, let's move on, and we certainly have more time for questions up ahead. And but Dave Jackson is going to talk to us now about how you can help stop the spread of the pest and prevent damage to your property and the environment. So, Dave, you want to take the head? There you go.
I'm gonna let Heather. Do you want to cover this slide, and I'll jump in at the end here?
Sure, I can do that. So this slide briefly just talks about some of the steps of spotted lanternfly management that we have outlined, really for anyone who's affected by spotted lanternfly. Number one being for all of you watching this webinar is stop the spread. So if you see anything that looks like spotted lanternfly, please report it. And if you're ever in the quarantine zone in Pennsylvania, please make sure you check your gear, check your belongings before you're leaving that area. Scraping eggs, banding trees to catch the nymphs, removing Tree of Heaven, and applying insecticides. So both using herbicides and using insecticides on its preferred host, Tree of Heaven, are other options. And I'm going to kind of leave it vague with the rest of the management techniques, so Dave has plenty of time to talk about the Tree of Heaven. So go ahead, Dave.
Okay, and we can start actually on that back slide for a second here, if you want, Jan. So as you see, there's a lot of different methods that we discuss and are recommending is from an integrated point of view. So we're going to focus in on two of these, and one is the Tree of Heaven. And we use Tree of Heaven for two reasons. Number one, as Heather pointed out, it is a preferred host by the lanternfly, and we can use it to monitor for populations and try to look for Tree of Heaven and see if the insect is on it, particularly in areas outside of the quarantine areas. And secondly, we can use the Tree of Heaven as a very selective means of controlling the insect, and I'll talk more about that. We call that the trap tree method. So next slide. So it's very important that you learn how to identify this tree. It's a very common tree across the entire United States. It's an invasive tree that was introduced from China, but it has spread literally across and been introduced across much of the United States, and it's very numerous across the Midwestern part of the state, but it's found all the way into California and even down into Arizona. So that's not good news for us if the insect can use that to spread on. But anyhow, learning to identify it is important because it has a number of native lookalikes. So first off, the leaves on this tree are very diagnostic, and they're very different from a lot of our native trees. It has a very long compound leaf, a pinnately compound leaf, which means it has a central stem called a rachis with multiple leaflets. The leaves can be from 1 to 4 feet in length. And the real key with the leaves are to look at the leaflets. The leaflets have a smooth margin along the edge of the leaf there, which means they don't have teeth or serrations like our native lookalikes do. But what they do have, and you can see in the yellow circles there, are these glandular teeth. So they'll have 1 or 2 glandular teeth right at the base of the leaflet. And that's a real diagnostic characteristic. If you turn those leaves over, you'd actually see the little gland there right at the tip of that tooth. Next slide. And the other thing is, if you were to crush this leaf, you could smell this very strong offensive odor. Some people say it smells similar to burnt peanut butter or cat urine, so something that's very offensive. So next slide.
Hold on 1 second. There we go. Okay.
So the branching pattern is alternate on Tree of Heaven. It has these smooth, very stout greenish brown twigs, and in the wintertime you could identify it by looking at the V or heart-shaped leaf scars, so where the leaves came off the trees. And also if you break a branch open looking at the center or the pith, it has this brown spongy pith. And then the bark is very characteristic. Some people describe it, particularly on younger trees, as looking like the skin on a cantaloupe. Next slide. So the tree is also dioecious, which means it has male and female trees. So the female trees are the ones that are going to be producing the seeds. And this comes into play in particular when we're looking at trying to eliminate this tree. We really want to focus on seed producers. They can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds annually. The seeds will typically hang on the tree throughout the winter, and they're these papery samaras, and you can see them. They stand out very readily on the landscape, particularly when you're driving down the highways. You can pick them out. Next slide.
Sorry, I'm having problems with the mouse here. Hold on. There we go. Okay.
So the tree can grow to very large sizes. Most people don't see them this large, but anywhere from 80 to 100 feet in height and 6 feet in diameter. But it's a clonal tree, and it spreads by sending up root suckers. The root suckers can come up as far away as 50 feet from the parent tree, and you can see in that picture on the right a number of different clonal patches where the taller trees are in the center and the younger trees coming off that parent tree's root system are spreading that tree out across there. Next slide. So one of the means that we discussed as far as an integrated approach is to use Tree of Heaven as a trap tree, where we remove most of the Tree of Heaven, leaving a handful of trees on the landscape, and we'll talk more about how we remove them here in the next slide. But then what we would do is treat the trees that we're leaving with a systemic insecticide, and when the lanternflies would feed on those trees, they would take in the insecticide and it would control them. The really nice thing about this method is that it's very selective, where if we're doing this on other tree species, there's a very good chance that we're going to kill a lot of native insects that might also be feeding on that tree. But with Ailanthus or Tree of Heaven, there's only one other insect that we know of that feeds on it, and that's the Ailanthus webworm, which is actually an insect that was native to Florida and has moved up and expanded its range with the expansion of Tree of Heaven. So we can be pretty selective in what we're controlling by using this trap tree method. Next slide. So let's talk about control of Tree of Heaven, because there's been a lot of misinformation about this tree. So keep in mind that this is a root suckering species. So if you just simply cut this tree down, it can spread prolifically and by sending up new sprouts. So with the trap tree method, we're recommending that you target female trees in particular, but removing 85% of the Tree of Heaven that you might have in a particular area, leaving just a handful of trees that you're going to use as your trap trees. To do this, we're recommending herbicide treatments. So apply July to September so that you get good translocation to the roots, and they can be foliar applications, hack and squirt using space cuts, or basal bark applications. And the active ingredient that we're recommending is triclopyr. So we feel like that will allow you to leave a tree that might even be on the same root system as the trees that you're treating. Next slide. And so cutting Tree of Heaven alone, as I said, is not going to be effective. You're going to turn one tree literally into hundreds, quite possibly. as it will send up stump sprouts and root sprouts. And also, we're not recommending cutting and treating stumps with a herbicide as well. We have found that this will simply control the stump, but not control the root system. So we say treat it first, kill the tree first, and then cut it down. Give it at least 30 days. I think there's one more click there, Jana, if you would. Actually, one more. So we're suggesting that if you have to remove the tree, to treat it first and give it time, 30 days at least, for the herbicide to work to control it, and then come back and remove it. So that way you get control of the root system. Next slide. So with the trap trees, once we have our trap trees left, or we might even be working with just a few individual tree of heaven on a property, we're going to treat those trees with a systemic insecticide. These can be applied as either bark sprays or soil drenches. The active ingredients we're recommending are dinotefuran or imidacloprid, and we want to apply those in July or August so that it's in the tree when we have adults that are going to be feeding on those trees. And you can see in that photograph on the left there how many lanternflies that we can control with this method. So, and I think that's all I have, Jana.
Great. And Nancy, I see that we have some questions coming in for Dave.
Yes, I'll ask the first one quickly. How far north is Tree of Heaven located? It's well into Canada, isn't it?
Oh, good question. I don't know that I have that map right at my fingertips, but it has a very wide distribution. Yes, I could pull that up as we were going and check that.
I don't know if I can say this right. The triclopyr being used by landowners without an applicator's license, or do you need to be a PMP for that?
No, you can purchase that and apply that to your own property without an applicator's license. It's probably not something that you're going to find at your local garden center. It would be something you would have to purchase online probably.
But Tom Kuhar mentions that brown marmorated stink bug also is a feeder of Tree of Heaven.
Another introduce. So we're saying native insects.
Right.
Yep.
I read that ailanthus is somewhat toxic and could cause allergic reactions. Do you know anything about that?
So we're looking into that. There has been a few isolated incidences of people that have had allergic reactions to it, whether it was from the sap or the foliage. I have some research papers that I am digging into right now to find out a little bit more about that, if it was just an isolated incident or if this is something that we're seeing more common. But right now I don't have the answers to that yet.
Do they attack oaks and hickories?
Do the insects?
Yes.
Heather, do you want to answer that one? She's got a thumbs up.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. And pretty much anything.
That's part of the list of 70.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Are you finding that the lanternfly is displacing brown marmorated stink bugs since they share some of the same plant species?
So what we're finding with brown marmorated stink bug is that the populations there have really declined in most areas. In some areas, they're still dispersing and increasing in numbers. But those have kind of declined independently of spotted lanternfly. So right now we don't have any research to suggest that there's any interaction between lanternfly and stink bug.
And I would add, because stink bug feeds upon the fruit and can actually pierce the fruit, whereas lanternfly cannot pierce fruit but feeds strictly on plant sap. I don't know that it would displace necessarily.
Okay, and I have a couple of questions. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, Nancy, I pulled up a map on the distribution for Tree of Heaven, and they show it in Ontario and Quebec as well.
Yeah, someone posted that it's non-native to North America, where it is distributed from British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, all the way to Southern California and Mexico. So yeah, everywhere.
Yeah.
I got a couple of questions about the trap trees. How far should trap trees be from desirable plants? And I thought there was another one in here. Is there any effect of herbicide and insecticide on watershed? How does the triplet react with that? Can't say that word.
Okay. So let's answer the first one. So if you wanted to be very selective and you were concerned about possibly uptake by other species of trees and plants, for example, from Doug Talmay's work, we know that oaks, for example, host numerous other species of native insects. And if you were to use those as trap trees, treating them with a systemic, you could potentially kill a lot of desirable natives. Root overlap would certainly be a concern. So what we would suggest is that you're more selective in your application. So you can do stem injections, which would need to be done by a certified applicator, or you can treat stems with a bark spray. So you're not pouring the insecticide onto the soil around the base of the tree, and that way you don't have to be concerned about other species taking that up. So there's ways to put the insecticide directly into the Atlantis stem only. And I forget the other question.
The effect of herbicide on watershed, home water wells, etc.
Okay, so triclopyr, the active ingredient found in products like Garland 3A, actually has aquatic labeling. And again, we're not suggesting that we're broadcasting this stuff across the environment. We're able to be very selective in our application methods. And again, we can put it directly into the stems that we're trying to treat. So we can inject it into those stems with hack and squirt, where we're placing it into those cuts, or we can apply it directly to the stem with basal bark applications. So foliar applications, you would have to be a little bit more concerned about non-targets being in the area, but it doesn't have soil activity. And again, the amine formulation of triclopyr found in products like Garland 3A is aquatic labeled.
And
so let's take some more questions in a little while and move on to Julie, and she's going to tell us about the latest research about effective IPM techniques for spotted lanternfly.
Okay. Hi. So I wanted to let you know that when spotted lanternfly was first detected in September 2014, within 1 to 2 weeks of that event, USDA immediately called together a technical working group of scientists from around the world, from around the country. That included myself. I was not at Penn State at the time. I was in North Carolina. It included researchers at Penn State, at various USDA facilities around the country, and again, other folks from around the world. And so starting that following spring, 2015, USDA presented Farm Bill funding for several different research projects on spotted lanternfly. And so, for example, myself, I started looking, using genetic tools to look for the origins of the invasive population. We had folks immediately looking for lure development, for pheromones, for traps, and for impacts on grapes. And so research started, again, funded 1 year at a time on Farm Bill funding in a variety of different areas. And we've met up and talked and whatnot across those, the 2015 field season and the 2016 field season. And then last summer, it was actually my first summer here in Pennsylvania. And what everyone saw was that the populations were much larger than expected. And it was the first time we really were seeing damage to grape crops. And then at the end of the season, we saw spotted lanternfly moving on to apple and other stone fruit. And particularly given the value of those industries, we realized that, you know, we need to shift and be more organized. And so at that point, if you could go to the next slide, please, Yana. Several of us from Penn State and other institutions around the country organized together. We submitted a research proposal for a USDA specialty crops grant that was not funded, but in the meantime, Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and Penn State kind of stepped up and provided some funding for a variety of different projects to be completed this year. And that's mostly what I'm going to summarize. We realized we need answers now. And so along the lines of some of the studies that are currently going on, and as Heather mentioned, we're working on the insecticide studies right now. We have studies that are being conducted by folks at Penn State, looking at the efficacy of various compounds in controlled atmospheric storage and killing the egg cases. Certainly that's important. It's not really practical to broadcast sprays, 100 feet up in the air in trees and whatnot, but in terms of being able to manage egg cases that might move on apple crates, for example, or on other structures, we need a good means to control them. Also, where we are here, we're out at the Penn State Berks campus, and that's where we're conducting our tests of insecticides on fruit trees and on grapes. And so far this year, we've tested 20 insecticides against nymphs on peach. The smaller subset of those that were effective, we tested against adults on peach, and today we're starting our trials on insecticides on adults on grapevines. Because lanternfly hits so many different things, we need to look at what, we need to make recommendations for green industry and for homeowners as well. And so we have some studies that have been looking at efficacy of insecticides and various ornamentals. And so here we're actually collaborating with industry. We have 2 sites that were each planted with maple at the same time as developments went up. And so we know the history of those trees, and those are treated with various compounds and various application rates of dinotefuran and whatnot. And so we'll be getting data on those. And then one of our collaborators is Tracy Lesky. So the extension and researchers who are in our audience will probably recognize Tracy Lesky's name because she led over 11 years of funded research on BMSB, brown marmorated stink bug, and was lead of the STOP BMSB project. And so she's actually looking to, in our collaboration, develop a quarantine greenhouse facility at Fort Detrick, Maryland, where we can test, in this case, insecticides under controlled lab conditions, but also examine other aspects of behavior. So that greenhouse is slated to be permitted and us getting into it by September this year. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of first lines of defense, we need a trap. As yet, spotted lanternfly, Miriam Cooperman at the USDA Otis Lab in Massachusetts has tested the attractiveness of a variety of compounds to spotted lanternfly and landed upon methyl salicylate as a lure. And actually, she, along with Heather Leach and Tracy Lesky's lab in West Virginia, are testing these lures using multiple pest designs. And so in collaboration with folks at Virginia Tech, these experiments are being conducted in Pennsylvania, where we have high densities of the pest and high pest pressure, and in Virginia, low pest pressure. And so those data are being collected weekly. And so we'll have some cool results there. Next slide, please. In terms of, we recognize that despite the, literature of, the research that was conducted on spotted lanternfly in Korea, we really don't know what the impact it has on the physiology of plants. And so we have a study going where we have spotted lanternflies in varying numbers on caged individual 3-year-old grapevines, and we're measuring various aspects of grape physiology. Also, we're looking at impact on ornamentals similarly. Next slide, please. Certainly, there's an importance of looking at classical biological control, and here several labs have been working on that. Kim Holmer, who's USDA ARS in Delaware, with Julie Gould from the Otis Lab, have been exploring China and spotted lanternfly's native range to find native predators and parasitoids that we might be able to introduce here. Also, Hu-Ping Liu has actually found a parasitoid that was introduced here for gypsy moth about 2 decades ago, and it actually is using spotted lanternfly egg cases. Not in high numbers yet, but that is continued to be monitored. Next slide, please.
Yes.
For brown marmorated stink bug, we know that the a pheromone was identified and used as a trap, and certainly Tom Baker at Penn State, and then Miriam Cooper Band at the Otis Lab have been on the hunt for a spotted lanternfly pheromone. And they're pretty convinced, and we're pretty convinced in general, that spotted lanternfly has no pheromones. Other plant hoppers are known to use substrate-borne vibration for communication. No plant hoppers are known to produce any pheromones. And so certainly we're interested in that, the basis of that communication, as well as other aspects of mating behavior in lanternfly. And so one thing that we noticed last year, the image that Heather had shown you with the lanternfly coming into apple, we noticed a large bout of flight late in the season. And basically what we found is that when spotted lanternfly are able to lay eggs, they're that large, they have that pretty yellow abdomen, but prior to that, their abdomen's largely black, and that is when they fly. When they get large enough to be fecund and settle down, they're incapable of flight. So we're trying to match up what is the risk of dispersal of mated females, but to date, it appears data from Tom Baker suggests that they are not mated when they exhibit that flight behavior. Next slide. I'll go quickly here. As I said, I'm looking for genetic markers. What we know so far using the markers that were developed in Korea is that Korea is not the origin of the current Pennsylvania population, but those markers are not variable enough for us to tell much more. So I'm working on developing variable markers to track this population and better hone in on its origin. Next slide. Also, sooty mold was the way that spotted lanternfly did its primary damage in Korea. And so we began looking at sooty mold development, again, using DNA sequencing to characterize what it is that comprises sooty mold. And also some of the work in my lab is looking at the obligate bacterial symbionts of lanternfly, potentially as a means to disrupt the transmission to the next generation. Next slide, please. And then finally, we realized that there's a great deal of work that needs to be done on understanding the feeding behavior of spotted lanternfly, in particular, testing its dependence on a requirement for tree of heaven. Since this insect only lives one generation per year, in order to really test that, we would require trying to develop spotted lanternfly on other hosts through adult, and folks in the Otis lab have been able to get lanternfly to develop from nymphs to adults on several other hosts, but no one has successfully been able to get them to then mate, lay eggs, and have the eggs successfully overwinter. Even feeding them Ailanthus, we do not have a colony yet in anywhere, and nor in Korea, that's been able to successfully get lanternfly through one whole year of its life cycle. Also, we're looking at artificial diets, penetrating feeding, what are the components of the salivary glands, a bunch of different things going on. So with that, I think I'll take any questions people might have, but that gives you an overview of the kinds of things we're looking at.
Thank you. Nancy?
So I've got lots of questions. I don't know how long you want to go on, but I will start with from the top and work down. Has South Korea been able to control spotted lanternfly?
They have an outbreak every several years, so it's still a problem, but not as not a huge problem. And so what was interesting there is that it appeared that, from how they wrote about things, that they experienced a population crash, but that was never part of the literature. And so Tracy Lesky went to South Korea this spring and visited with some Korean entomologists at their annual meeting, and she took a list of questions, and one of them was exactly that. And what they said was that they believe that they did have a population crash. They did introduce a parasitoid, but they found that by the time they had introduced it, that parasitoid was already there. And so they attributed the crash in their populations to that parasitoid.
Second question, if beneficial insects feed on honeydew produced by the neonic poison lanternfly, how will it affect them?
That's certainly something we're very keen on watching. We have not seen any issues. There have been studies where for trap trees, we had beehives that were monitored, and their wax and honey were monitored over time. And there, because the trap trees treated with the neonicotinoid are Ailanthus, it appears that pollinators do not use those flowers. And the timing is such that, I forget the details here, but this was Robin Underwood, who is a faculty member at Kutztown University, who's looked at this. And so basically it appears that when treating tree of heaven, that doesn't put other insects or pollinators at risk for being poisoned from feeding on spotted lanternfly honeydew, but certainly that's something that we're very aware of. And one of our scientists here, David Bittinger at the Fruit Research Experimental Center, is a bee expert. He's working on these insecticides, and that's something that's close to his heart and that he's been monitoring as well.
And maybe I can jump in. There was a question that came in through the chat, which is for Dave or anyone else. Are you seeing damage in forest stands?
So I'm gonna let Heather answer that question down that way.
Go ahead for it, yeah.
Well, so I think we'll both answer here. So basically, not yet, but would be the issue. And so certainly, you know, when you're talking about forested areas, you know, that kind of damage is going to take place over time. Certainly, we are seeing what appear to be, you know, the oozing, you know, some trunk blowout, some things that look like damage. We saw some tree of heaven that were heavily fed upon last year that looked to be dead this year, but then in some cases they've recovered when they're not fed upon. And so the jury is still out because any kind of effective lanternfly, we're too early in the invasion to necessarily see big impacts at this point. From the Korean literature, that was a question we sent over with Tracy as well. We said, did you see impacts in your forested areas? And they said, yes, they did, but because those trees weren't economically valued, those effects were not quantified. Certainly one thing that we're really worried about, though, is that sooty mold growth on the understory plants. And from a longer term perspective, what does that mean for understory regeneration and nutrient cycling? So we have other folks in forestry at Penn State, but also working in collaboration with, you know, forestry individuals in the state and federal level in trying to address those questions and maybe using drones and whatnot to try to track that damage if it really does occur.
Yeah, and I'll just add the other thing that we haven't seen yet is we haven't seen the insect move to the areas of our state where we really have the economically important forests. So the southeastern part of our state isn't an area that's really a big timber market for our state.
What we're worried about there is that we do see, like at the edge of more forested systems here in the southeastern part of the state, we see lanternfly using the wild grapevines that tend to be like very large in diameter and very old and form almost a reticulate network through the forest. And so one thing that we're concerned about is that, you know, could that wild grapevine be a network that would allow them to penetrate into the forest further than we might otherwise expect. But again, that's something that folks are starting to look at.
Well, we have time for one more quick question.
Oh boy, we got a lot of questions here. Can you use willows as trap trees since they have methyl salicylate?
No, they feed on willows just fine, and actually strongly. They seem to really like willow. So the methyl salicylate doesn't deter them. We're actually seeing that it in the field it doesn't seem to attract them either. So we're still looking for effective compounds to either attract or repel them.
Okay, I'm going to throw one more out here. Is systemic application for preferred trees possible, which could sterilize the insects?
Not at this time, I guess is the best answer for that one. Hopefully we could come up with something with sterilization, but yeah, we don't have anything that's like a systemic treatment that we could utilize.
All right, well, I know we could carry on with questions for a while, and maybe we'll have to invite you back in the spring and for an update, which would be interesting, and more questions. And we'll also make sure the questions go to Dave and Julie and Heather too. So I want to wrap up. First is to point out that we have a site on our website called Find a Colleague, where you can put a profile of yourself and your research interests, and then say what kind of colleagues you're looking to collaborate with. And our goal here is to increase collaboration in the Northeast and through other regions too. Feel free to use that. So I'd invite you to put a profile up. And today's webinar is going to be viewable on demand. It'll take a few days, so probably into maybe early next week before the recording is up. You can go back and watch it as often as you like. Here is the link, but also you'll receive an email because you've registered, so you'll receive an email with the recording. Tomorrow we have a really fantastic discussion on Cornell's climate smart farming program, and there's a bunch of online tools that are really useful. in using for farming and climate shifting. And next week on Tuesday, we have John Tucker talking about no-till corn silage systems. And also we have someone from Northeast SARE who's going to be talking about their funding opportunities that are available. And I also wanted to point out that the next two webinars are at a different time. They're at 2 o'clock. We tried to mix up the time so it works better for people. So they're not going to be at 11 o'clock. And finally, our RFA for our 2019 grants is out. Came out on Monday. The deadline is November 15th, and you can find that on our website too. So I want to.
Can I just mention one, just a couple of things about Lanternfly, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure.
There's some great resources on Penn State's website and also on our Northeastern IPM website. If you look at the Spotted Lanternfly working groups, so if you go to our main page, I can't throw the link up, but if you look at our main page, go to the working groups tab and the Spotted Lanternfly. All of the presentations from the Spotted Lanternfly working group that happened earlier this summer are there. Just the PDF slides, no presentations, but there's a ton of information there. And also on the Penn State's site. So if you want to go answer some of these questions, you can look there, and we'll also try and answer them. Thank you.
Great, and I was going to say, I can also send a link to that when we send you a link to the recording, so you have access to that. And we just want to acknowledge the funders of this research and these fine people who are doing great work. And I just want to end to say thank you to Dave and Julie and Heather. I know you're super busy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to put this together and the preparation that's been involved in bringing your expertise with such grace to Zoom. And so thank you. And thank you for finding a Barnes & Noble that had a very quiet children's section.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Oh, I'm impressed. I would have said the children's section was the last section I would go to for peace and quiet in Barnes & Noble.
Thanks for having us on.
All right, terrific. Well, thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.